Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Crowe Horwath webinar as we will be exploring the topic of It's 2018. Do you know who and what is connected to your network? We're delighted to have you joining us for this session, and my name is Matthew Lyon. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us as we explore the topic of It's 2018. Do you know who and what is connected to your network with our keynote presenters? Gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and hand the session over to the two of you at this time.
Thanks, Matt. Good day, everybody. My name is Chris Refkin. I'm a Senior Manager at Crowe Horwath, and with me today is Jim Plazinski, Vice President at Great Bay Software. Today we're going to be talking to you about an interesting topic in healthcare related to understanding what is attached to your networks and your environment. Some of our key learning objectives here are focusing around what we're going to talk about is holistic approach to cybersecurity, so kind of bringing this down to a manageable term and less of a buzzword. Talking about some elements related to Security 101. A lot of times today you hear folks talking about emerging technologies and trends and a lot of advanced and very significantly impactful in the space of security technology. However, some of those key technologies that are emerging are not necessarily effective without some Security 101 elements baked into your overall security program. So we're going to hit upon that a little bit. And we're also going to bring some awareness or hope bring to the forefront of your conversations related to the impact of cybersecurity, not only on data privacy and confidentiality, but also patient safety, and then also the rest of the organization. And I think that's a key conversation for you to have within your organization, is really raising awareness of the cybersecurity impact across the organization and bridging the gap from the cyber world to the physical world. This slide here is going to give a little bit of an overview of our agenda of what we're going to cover here. I won't go through it entirely, but just wanted to highlight some of the elements that we'll be discussing with you today. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to my esteemed colleague here, Mr. Jim Plazinski, Vice President at Great Bay, and he's going to start talking to you a little bit about the current state of healthcare security and medical devices. Jim?
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Chris. And good morning, everyone. So as we look at the topic of healthcare and security, let's talk a little bit about the state of the environment today. And I'm sure for many of you, as you're living this, these are going to be some highly relatable considerations as you think about your own environment. So the first thing really starts with you have more devices in your environment today than ever before. We're seeing a tremendous proliferation of new devices in your ecosystem, particularly in the biomedical device area, in the IoT device area. And one of the key considerations that we're hearing from organizations that we spend a lot of time with is that there's a lot of uncertainty tied to the security of these devices. If you do any basic level of research about biomedical or IoT devices, it's not too difficult to uncover some vulnerabilities and risks that exist tied to these devices. So that uncertainty, the proliferation of new devices, it's really a great opportunity potentially for your organization to further things in the patient safety area, but there's also some concerns in the patient safety area as well, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here this morning. So as we're looking at this proliferation of new devices, one of the key things that really stands out to most organizations is really the sheer volume increase that they're experiencing. And so if you've done any industry research on this topic, as you're thinking about what's going on in your environment, you're probably familiar with statistics such as the one that was put out by Gartner recently saying that by 2020, we're expecting that IoT devices are going to outnumber user-oriented devices such as laptops, tablets, and smartphones at a 3-to-1 type ratio, which is pretty incredible as you think about the sheer number of traditional devices you probably have in your environment today. IoT is going to triple that current number that you're used to. And as you think about this as a healthcare organization, one of the first things that stands out and one of the metrics that we hear really starting to be a pretty tried and true one is that you look at the number of beds that you have in your hospital system, and what you can expect is that on average organizations are seeing about 15 to 17 devices per bed. And that's a huge number as you think about, again, a lot of folks hear that, maybe they're a little surprised by that number originally, but we're seeing this as now proving to be a pretty tried and true data point for just about any healthcare provider. And so overall, what we know is that hospitals typically have 300 to 400% more medical equipment than traditional IT devices. So these ratios that Gartner's speaking about up above, it's already there in your environment, and that's according to a statistic that was recently shared from the folks at HIMSS. So as you think about this, again, there's a tremendous new influx of devices in your environment, but one of the things that is of primary concern as you contemplate that is what is the potential risk that is now surfacing in your environment as well, tied to that new influx of devices in this area. And so some statistics to think about and to discuss as an organization, as not only a security team, but as a business team, is that today only 9% of manufacturers are saying that they test their medical devices at least annually. And obviously as a security individual, that's probably a very concerning statistic to you. Probably even more importantly, as a healthcare provider, and you think about the importance of patient care and patient safety, that's a very concerning statistic. As you think beyond that, what we're hearing as well is that only 51% of device makers are saying that they follow the guidance from the FDA to mitigate or reduce inherent security risks in medical devices. Now, as I first heard that stat, I was surprised, number one, that they would admit to that. That's definitely a big concern. But clearly, unsurprisingly, because of that statistic, in the first statistic as well, 67% of device makers believe it's likely that there will be an attack on one of these devices they've built within the next 12 months. So this culmination of these three data points together is obviously very concerning as a healthcare provider, where patient safety is premier focus for your organization. You're understanding that in this ecosystem, the device manufacturers aren't taking security as seriously as you would expect or hope. And so as a result, what can you start to think about as an organization to be hyper-vigilant to this risk? Because this risk is in your environment now, and it's about figuring out how can you start to prepare to address that. So why is that such an important thing to consider? Well, what and we look back at, again, so we're talking about all these potential negatives, right? But what you're thinking about as a healthcare system is, well, we're bringing all these devices into our environment, right? And well, why is that? Because there's clearly a tremendous benefit that organizations can really achieve by leveraging these new technologies in your ecosystem. And that's great. And you want to look at things, healthcare providers are always thinking about cost management. And this is perhaps a great way to drive automation and improved patient care experience. It can help you really just improve the overall conditions in your environment just from an operational efficiency standpoint as well as from a patient care and safety standpoint. But then clearly thinking ahead in tandem with that to the risks, we know these devices sit in this vulnerable spot, and as you reflect on some of the recent attacks that have been unfolding in the market, some of the ransomware attacks, the vulnerabilities that have now recently been exposed tied to this device category, thinking about the potential impact tied to, perhaps telecare or telehealth style interruptions, these are vulnerabilities that can be extremely damaging to your organization. And clearly the first thing you're worried about as an organization is, ensuring that patient care and patient safety is being delivered at the level you want. IoT and biomedical devices can be a mechanism to achieving this, but it also can be a risk. And figuring out a program and a plan to ensure that you're rolling out these devices in your environment in a safe way is very important. So let's talk a little bit about, again, what is kind of the scope of the risk that you can expect as an organization tied to patient trust and patient safety. So one of the statistics that has probably stood out to me the most over the past 6 months, as I've been spending a lot of time in this market, is tied directly to, when you think about the percentage of healthcare organizations that have sustained a breach over the past 2 years. I saw a stat just recently, 90% of healthcare organizations have experienced some type of breach in the past 2 years. And that means just about everybody on this call has probably been impacted in one way or another. Now again, depending on the scope of that breach, that may have a varying level of impact on your organization. But as you look at some of the more extreme breach scenarios, what businesses are experiencing as it relates to a significant event, a significant incident, is on average 5.5% churn of their overall customers/revenues. And so as you think about what you're trying to protect here, right, a lot of folks today, there's become an increasing level of maybe risk tolerance in the market. But one of the things that I know just about any executive that I work with is talking about is revenue growth and revenue protection. And as I saw the statistic, and as you look across the various industries in the bar graph on the right here, what you can see is that but just behind financial services, healthcare organizations experience the greatest churn when a major incident unfolds. And why is that? This is because people take their PHI data, this personal health information data, it's a very private thing, and they want that protected. And in the incidents where this unfolds, there's a lot of options for them from a healthcare provider standpoint. And so they can always consider other alternatives. And you're seeing this play out in your industry, which again speaks to the importance of putting together a program and a plan to ensure that your risk in this area is mitigated.
Matt, will you tee this up for us, please?
Be more than happy to take the lead on this, gentlemen. Thank you again for that. So we bring this question to our audience asking, what areas do you feel is the least risky, or maybe it's most well managed for patient safety and organizational impact? Is this going to be your traditional systems, your applications, your workstations, etc.? Are we talking about medical devices, networked and attached? Do you think it's the medical devices all? Are you looking at IoT devices such as IP cameras, the HVAC system, or maybe it's none of them? Gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and bring forward those results. They're up on screen, and I'd like to turn things back over to the two of you for a little bit of insight.
Yeah. No, very good. So, and interesting to see the results here, and I think probably not to anyone's surprise. Most organizations feel today that, the least risky and most well-managed device category is really kind of more of those traditional systems. And if you think about where we're at today in the market from a security maturity standpoint, that certainly makes a lot of sense, right? Ideally over the past number of years as an organization, you've been spending a lot of time, putting the right policies in place, ensuring you have the right technology systems to align with the security expectations of these device types. But as we look again at the next device categories where folks are flagging as being probably inevitably the greatest risk, right, where they're not as confident, it certainly is tied to this category of IoT devices. And again, for anybody who's done research on this, and if you haven't, I definitely would encourage you to just do some basic thinking about the types of devices that are in your environment. Do some research online as you maybe can reflect on 3 to 5 of the kind of most prevalent IoT or biomedical style devices in your environment. And unfortunately, what you'll find is there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are out there in this arena. And so, again, there are some approaches that firms, if you're thinking about getting back to the basics of security and putting together a security plan and program from a business maturity standpoint that's going to align with the complexities of the healthcare environment, what you want to do is start thinking about these IoT and biomedical devices, because this is the new threat vector that sits in a fairly vulnerable spot today. And what this means is that while you've spent a lot of time and money and effort over the years getting your traditional systems to a good spot, this is really the next vector you need to be preparing to protect. And we're going to discuss over the course of the rest of the session today some ways to think about that and some ways to perhaps approach that.
I agree with Jim here, and I think it will be interesting if we were in the live audience, to talk a little bit about the folks that identified medical devices and IoT devices as the least risky for your organizations. I think it'll be interesting to hear to see if that is just a gut feel, or if you've done some credible challenge within your organization to understand that from an empirical evidence standpoint. But again, I agree with Jim that if I placed my bet on the traditional systems that everybody's the most comfortable, most aware of, that would be the quote-unquote least risky for organizations to manage today. And as we move on here, talking about the visibility challenge. And this is something that we've, working together, identified through some practicing scenarios with clients of identifying and truly understanding intelligently what the entire spectrum of impact is on patient care. And so what I mean by that is it's not only traditional systems anymore. And medical devices are definitely, not a buzzword, but definitely top of mind for folks today in healthcare to understand what the security implications are of those devices. You know, there's great research being done by manufacturers to bring out the latest and greatest products to augment the methodologies they're using for cutting-edge research and surgeries and things along those lines. But really, what is that security around it? But then also thinking about some of those areas that, you know, a good number of the audience think is well managed within their organizations are these IoT devices. And we're going to talk about these a little bit and breaking it down of really understanding how all three of these intersect or impact the path of patient care. Because it's no longer the traditional systems that we're talking about, and it's no longer only medical devices, and it is also including these IoT type devices that we'll talk about here. So traditional systems. Today, historically, there's been, you know, workstations, electronic charts, servers, things along those lines that are typical within a healthcare environment or most any organization. You'd almost consider cutting edge from a security standpoint, getting your hands around doctors using personal emails or restricting the use of USB drives and things along those lines. BYOD policies or bring your own device policies. Those are the quote-unquote emerging risk areas that organizations within healthcare are still trying to get their hands around. I'm really thinking about this from a pragmatic standpoint. This is what everybody knows. This is the bread and butter, if you will, of IT strategy or CTO strategy of bringing technology into an organization and simply identifying those systems and securing those systems is again, the basics today. And this is where most resources, time, effort, and money are spent protecting or maturing their governance around or doing the related tasks, whether it's audit functions or other types of operational tasks to look at. Also, interesting enough, this is where most folks draw a line from a compliance standpoint. So HIPAA, for example. HIPAA, from what I've seen from clients' experiences, typically focus around the traditional area. And there's starting to bleed into some other areas that have direct impact to patient safety. But HIPAA is written from a patient privacy and confidentiality standpoint, so that awareness is not really baked into regulations to think about what are the other technologies that are built in or intersecting the path of patient care. So starting to talk about medical devices and really making this tangible, because through conversations and even the news media and industry, you hear medical devices, a very nebulous term that, yeah, there's medical devices out there. It's the boogeyman, if you will, that we don't know what exactly it is. We don't know how to well define it, but there's these medical devices and they can pose impact to people. So how we like to break it down is, yes, there's this huge environment or category of medical devices. Then we identify the next subset is the devices that have data processing, whether they're generating data or sending data, whatever that might be. And then we bring it down to and focus on the devices that are attached to a network, whether cellular, whether proprietary, whether wireless, whether wired networks. And this is really where I want to focus the conversation here, is talking about the exposure of these devices. So when you talk about medical devices that are offline, if you will, yeah, there's risk there. But when you think of the direct impact that a ransomware event or a hacker could have, or malicious manipulation of a device that could occur through a default password, let's say, odds are it's going to be through a device that's attached to a network. And that's really where we want to focus time and effort to really understand. And going back to the first polling question we have, folks identified a good number of view that identified that this was a well-managed area. And so the first thing I would want to understand is, how do you know what is out there? And most organizations, if I dare not say all organizations, struggle with a real intelligent inventory of those devices and systems that would fall into this medical device bucket that are attached to network. More often than not, when we go to organizations, we'll see devices attached to the network and it's like, oh, it's Biomed, don't touch it. Or that wireless network, yeah, we know it's running WEP, which is a deprecated form of wireless encryption, and say, oh, we can't touch it, it's Biomed. And so even if it is aware of this general issue or this general area of technology within the environment, it's not a focus to address. And then, again, going back to that polling question is, do you even know the medical devices that you have in the environment? And some folks might say that, yep, we go through Joint Commission certification, we do all these other activities, but at the end of the day, what is really actionable and knowledgeable about these devices that you have? And that prevents or presents a significant risk exposure that I don't think a lot of organizations really comprehend at this time. And then you start thinking about innovation. Then you start thinking about what else is going on, bringing, again, that thought of research. Just saw recently that Apple announced that on your iPhones, you're going to be able to get your personal health records on your phones. Apple Watches are probably going to be integrating any of your health activity with your medical record onto your personal device there. And that's just expanding the boundaries of your environment, of your potential exposure of when you bring these other systems into your ecosystem, as Jim mentioned. There's a whole different risk environment. Think about from a path of patient care standpoint, if folks brought generators down, if folks brought heating and ventilation down. I think a good example would be certain medications, drugs need to be kept at certain ambient temperatures from a preservation standpoint. If those cooling systems that are networked or considered IoT devices are compromised, you might compromise your entire batch of certain medication. It's the height of flu season. Could that impact individual quality of life if you're not able to treat the elderly or the young with the appropriate dosages of medication because they've been compromised? What's that impact to your organization? And it's really understanding all the other elements that are intersecting your path of patient care that don't fall in the medical device bucket, that don't fall in the traditional system bucket, but are still attached to your network. I think a good example to think about is, and probably be a little bit tangible for everybody, is thinking of security cameras. Most all organizations have security cameras, and I bet in a lot of them that are being renovated and are being remodeled are going to have IP-based cameras or network cameras. And if you think about those systems, are you even aware of what's plugged in from the systems and where they're located? More often than not, we find it that the security team, not through malfeasance or anything, but simply it's not their forte to understand the impact of these networked IP cameras, will get them installed with their vendor and they start monitoring security like they're tasked to do, but don't understand that without applying a password and a username to these devices, you can see and or hear patients within patient care areas. And these are real scenarios that we've been through. And again, that's a more traditional impact from the data confidentiality and privacy standpoint. So if you take that concept and apply it to, let's say, elevators or heating and cooling, as I mentioned, or other systems that are going to intersect the path of patient care, it really broadens the concept of protecting technology or securing technology for the organization. I think one of the key things that is interesting that Jim and I have talked about and really brought forward is ultimately security 101. No matter who you are or what you profess, the ability to securing what you know. You cannot secure what you do not know. It's such a foundational concept, but it's more than often overlooked. And in Jim and I's conversations we've had, you can look at whether it's the CISP, essentially the de facto certification for the security industry, whether it's the SANS Top 20, NIST, PCI, HIPAA. There's key concepts that are identified specifically as understanding the inventory of authorized devices or unauthorized devices as identified here in SANS. And that is something that is so fundamental, but is also so overlooked because it's not that shiny emerging trend or technology. And so much is built off of the premise of knowing what you have and then building a strategy around that. And again, going back to the polling question, which I think is really great, is for the folks that think some of these other areas are their least risky areas, go back to your teams and ask them, how did you build your strategy around this? Do you know what devices we have? And if you don't know what devices we have, that's fine. But how do you develop, let's say, a patch management strategy or password management strategy around these devices if you don't have them? You have to really make it a tangible conversation first and not talk in the ether about these devices. So once you know that you have these devices, then you can start building a strategy, start building your asks for resources and funds to protect these devices, and you're going to have a better reception in the C-suite or the board to say, hey, I have X number of devices, here's the fix, here's what's the cost, and here's the impact of not doing it. So you're giving a real actionable and intelligent conversation for folks that are going to be in charge of budgeting and risk management to address this and understand where to invest. And Matt, our next polling question, please.
Thank you very much. So we're bringing forward this question to ask you, where do you believe your organization has the greatest opportunity to enhance its posture? Is it going to be in the physical and digital risk assets area? Is it in the network design, or is it in the device visibility? We're bringing forward those results as well. We've got them on screen, gentlemen. We'd like to get your thoughts on what you see from everybody here.
This is exactly where I was expecting the results to come in, at least from the physical and digital risk assessment to be the priority number one, or the top item for the greatest opportunity to enhance posture, because I think this is the key element here. And I'm not sure or not if the audience picked the first answer here of trying to understand what a digital risk assessment is. And that's where I would think everybody is at. It's like, well, what the heck is a digital risk assessment? And so I'm going to pick that one as the greatest opportunity to enhance. And what we really use this digital risk assessment label to describe is that enhanced conversation, that enhanced perspective of impact to the organization. And so when you think about all these different modalities, if you will, from medical devices to IoT devices to the traditional systems, the impact to not only confidentiality and privacy, but also to patient quality of care. But then think about, and we'll touch upon this in a little bit, what's the impact to finances, as Jim referenced. You know, cybersecurity events can have an impact to finances. You can have an operational impact. You could probably have a reputational impact. And there's so many other areas that can have an impact that are just beyond confidentiality and data privacy that I think organizations really need to bring to the forefront of conversations, so you can understand that this is not just an IT issue, and this is not just a compliance issue, and it's not again, a boogeyman scenario here, thinking of cybersecurity and the real world impact, as we'll talk through some scenarios in a minute. Jim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think Chris's summary there is spot on, and you know, as we look at kind of the other categories as well, you know, maybe just a couple comments on those, because we had at least almost a quarter of the audience that really responded in those ways as well. You know, as you think today about this challenge of device visibility, again, you know, what we see is this is a pretty prevalent problem in the market, and what I know we talked about just on the previous slide was the importance of shoring this up. And Chris emphasized, you know, hey, there's a lot of frameworks out there that organizations follow, and the SANS and the CIS framework is just one of those that we illustrated on the previous slide. And what a lot of organizations maybe aren't always thinking about is that, you know, that's really a prioritized list. It's not, here's 20 things you can do, here's 20 things you can do, and here's the recommended priority that you should consider approaching these things. And so as you think about actually the interconnectivity of device visibility, understanding that piece, and then we look at the third response here of network design, understanding that visibility piece is very important to ensuring you put in place an appropriate network design at your organization. And I know for many firms today, you know, there's challenges around trying to figure out what's the best way to drive a network segmentation initiative at their organization. And one of probably the recommended focal points we would kind of start out by saying is just understand what you have, understand what that risk footprint is. And as we've spent a lot of time with CISOs of healthcare organizations, you know, one of the things we're starting to hear more and more is that they're really starting to think about, you know, how effectively can I measure and quantify my risk? And how effectively am I doing that at the security level at my organization? But also, how effectively am I raising awareness across the business tied to those types of risks? And so, again, one of the foundational pieces that can enable you to effectively do that is shoring up your visibility, making sure you assess your risk quite broadly so that you can then put in place the appropriate network design and security program to align with the areas of the greatest risk at your business. So to shift gears, you know, kind of back to the basics, and we're going to talk a little bit about Security 101, and again, with the context of healthcare, you know, how can you as an organization start to think about solving some of these challenges. We've spent a lot of time talking about the challenges today. Now start to think about, how do you put together a program and a plan that puts your organization in the best possible position to succeed. So, as you think about your security maturity as an organization today, what we see in the market is that organizations really are in all sorts of different spots. And oftentimes a big part of this is really tied directly to, kind of one size doesn't necessarily fit all. If you're a small hospital, a single site hospital system, the scope of your risk and maybe the sophistication of your environment in comparison to a, multi-billion-dollar, 40 to 100 site hospital system, is quite a differing level of risk, as well as probably things like budget in those environments that you can actually leverage. So, we definitely understand and appreciate that, and what your business then inevitably needs to do is, again, start out by trying to really measure your risk and understand your risk. And really, probably where that begins is really putting in place just an effective governance, risk, and compliance strategy. What as an organization do we need to put in place to ensure that we have fully grasped our risk and exposure in these critical areas tied to risk and compliance? And the secondary layer of that then is establishing a security architecture that puts us in position to succeed tied to that first bucket. And so what this requires for your organization, and if you haven't made these steps forward yet, what we're seeing is that the businesses that are doing this the best, they're doing this in a very cross-functional and collaborative way. We're seeing that they're actually establishing an organization-wide steering committee, which is comprised of all sorts of critical groups of the organization. Your security team is clearly represented at this table, your CIO or CTO. You're likely going to have representation nowadays from a clinical or a biomedical engineering type set of resources. You want to involve your risk management teams, maybe your HR and your legal teams, as well as quality assurance and those that are really kind of focused on, ensuring that patient care and patient safety is delivered at an appropriate level. We certainly have an appreciation as well for the need for efficiency in patient care and patient safety as well. So as you think about how you want to approach this, one of the first things you want to do is make sure that it's a cross-functional exercise. If you find yourself as a security professional constantly going into meetings and feeling like you're having to remind individuals of why things are important, you may want to consider, challenging your leadership team to think about this differently and making it a cross-functional and collaborative buy-in to approaching this problem, because the risk is quite significant. I'll bring you back to where we kind of started earlier on in the session today. If you can't have an effective approach for driving governance, risk, and compliance and overall security in your organization, your revenues can be at risk to the tune of, if you have a major breach, a question to pose to your CEO is, we're going to have a potential 5.5% loss in revenues. How are we going to handle that? We need to take this seriously. We need everybody at the organization to take this seriously. And one of the best ways to do that is to establish really a committee-style approach to aligning with the organization's expectations and requirements. So, really understanding the fundamentals is key. So as you're thinking about, we talked about in the last polling question, this physical and digital security assessment. So one of the fascinating stats, again, that we've heard recently is that 54% of healthcare business decision makers admit that they do not regularly conduct regulatory risk assessments. And I think that aligns pretty well with the percentages we saw in the last polling question, ironically enough. So as you think about this, what you should really be looking to accomplish as it relates to these current state assessments is, do we really understand where we're at today tied to the people element of security, the processes around our security program, and the controls that we have in place, and that can be inclusive, of course, of technology. So really starting to understand that, and do we understand, probably most importantly, the impact of those things as it is related to patient safety, operational impact of the organization, our reputation as a healthcare entity, and our revenues, right? So really starting to look at those things, quite broadly, and start to ask some of the tough questions. And hearing that, more than half of the organizations today aren't doing this, if you're in that half group, we would really recommend starting to look at this with a serious lens, because it's important to helping to set the right course for your business. So the second piece of that equation really, starts to head to kind of this IT and network-oriented strategy. And so, again, what are some things you want to consider here? So does our business strategy align with our IT strategy? And does security really support both of those things? Is our security strategy risk-centric, or is it threat and compliance-centric? We have these discussions a lot where, firms are oftentimes worrying maybe a little bit too much about compliance before risk. And again, I think a smart way to think about it, you have to balance those out. You need to be aware of your compliance obligations, because inevitably that's tied to a lot of your risk. But you want to prop up risk first. And you want to think about some of the things, in particular, the kind of the crux of this webinar today is really tied to assessing medical device level risk and IoT device risk and overall network risk for all devices on your network. And so being able to just ask questions around, what types of data do we have on medical devices? What types of data do they create, store, and transmit? Understanding that. Does the medical device, does it encrypt data in transit and at rest? Right? Or can you confidently answer that question as it relates to each device in your ecosystem today? Does the medical device allow the password to be changed by the administrator? And does it support password complexity? Right? I know Chris has found some pretty fascinating things as he's dug into this topic with his clients. And certainly this is an area that if you haven't looked into this yet, you likely have some risk there, and you want to be able to understand that. Understanding what operating system a medical device or an IoT device has is also very important. A lot of these devices are shockingly coming to market with Windows XP as their operating system. And so what we know, and what I think a lot of organizations experience here recently, is when you have old operating systems that can't be patched, that can pose a pretty large risk to your organization. And again, looking back over to the left bucket here, your operational effectiveness, your patient care, your patient safety. There's been some pretty frustrating and sad stories in the market here recently, where I heard one not too long ago where a hospital system was taken offline for 17 days due to a ransomware attack. They were resorted to pen and paper. That's a miserable experience. And I think if you looked into the eyes of the security professional who led that team there at that business, if you asked him, hey, did you ever think that could happen? Probably he never thought it was going to be him. So just being able to, again, understand where your risk lies. And again, it comes back to the fundamentals here of real-time network and device level visibility. If you don't know what you have, if you don't understand what are those components that can create potential major issues for you from a security standpoint, how can you effectively drive a security plan and program to support your organization's objectives tied to risk and compliance? So just think about these things holistically. These are the fundamentals to helping ensure that you're going to be pointing your organization in a good direction tied to security. So, again, bringing back to just some other questions to contemplate. We talked about at the medical device layer and at the IoT device layer some of the risks that maybe are out there that perhaps you haven't thought of yet. But critical questions to ask maybe more broadly is, do I know what devices are connected to the network? How confidently today can I answer that question of how many devices are on my network? How are they behaving? What are the core characteristics that may indicate that a device should be trusted or not trusted? Where is the device located? One of the other amazing statistics tied to security response today is that for organizations, the days to a remediated breach, once a breach has even been identified, is well north of 100 days. And so with that, one of the keys to understanding how to take action if a threat scenario is unfolding, right? Because the stats point to, if you haven't already been breached, you may just not know that you're currently being breached. So make sure you understand your footprint and understand what's out there, because if you're not confident in this, This is what results in incidents that can be very catastrophic for organizations on a number of fronts, both reputationally as well as just, again, maybe even to your revenues.
And speaking to the point of catastrophic incidents, over this past summer, the WannaCry ransomware attack that most significantly affected the UK health system is what we saw as the real translation of the risks that we're talking about today into real-world impact. And you can look over the last 10 years, there's been similar types of impacts stateside. There's numerous hospitals that we can talk of, even of the last week. A health system near close to where I used to live actually wound up paying the ransom in a ransomware attack because they didn't see any way out. And the key thing here is this is real. At the end of the day, this is a very real likelihood or outcome of having poor visibility into what your environment is. Because if you don't have if you have poor visibility, everything you build off of that cornerstone is going to be flawed. So that's your security strategy. That's probably your IT replacement strategy. Everything that you build off of those assumptions that you have is going to be flawed, and there's going to be an issue with. And one of the things I'm going to point out here is the whole phrase in the industry, it's not if, but when, I think is an awful term to use in the event that most organizations are not in a maturity position to assume that pretext. If you can tell me that your password policies are effective across the entire organization and it's not 6 letters and you never have to change your password and there's no complexity, that your patch management policy is good and actually effective, that permissions for file shares, applications, everything like that is good across the environment. Unless you really have good quality and mature security hygiene, I don't think any organization should hang their hat on it's not if but when. And this is really a cry out to say, hey, you really need to pay attention to this because this really can happen. And our next polling question, Matt?
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We bring this one forward to our audience members asking, how does your organization educate the workforce as well as the C-suite and the board as to the ramifications of good security practices? Are you looking at only focusing on the workforce? Are you occasionally reporting to the board? Maybe not much. The board gets what it needs from the Wall Street Journal or established quarterly reporting, looking at a little bit of the communications pathway that you're sharing with your team members to keep senior management and your teams informed of what's going on there. Final notice, we are going to go ahead and bring down those results for everyone. And gentlemen, we've got those up on screen for you and the rest of our audience members. I'd like to hand things back over to the two of you.
I think it's great to see that there's a lot of established reporting. I'd be interested to have conversations about the depth and breadth of the reporting that is being provided, and not necessarily giving boards or a CEO an 80-page risk assessment, but understanding the clarity or the transparency to the gap between the current state of known issues to remediation plans and any deficit of funds or resources to address those. Jim, do you have any comments?
Yeah, no, I would second that. It's indicative that a lot of folks here on the call are taking the progressive steps to raising that organizational awareness, and not only organizational awareness, but at that board level is pretty powerful. It's a great way to just get the support that you need for the critical initiatives that you're looking to drive as a security team, and inevitably helping out with your budget requests and things of that nature. So really positive to see that a lot of organizations here are doing some great upward communications at this point. And I think for those that haven't gotten to that point yet, there's a lot of great resources you can leverage for how to maybe approach that. And definitely, whether it's in your kind of peer community, folks can kind of point to some strategies that maybe you can incorporate, or obviously there's third parties that can assist you in that regard as well.
And with that, this next slide here, we have it labeled medical device risk landscape. This could essentially be labeled digital risk landscape. And I'm not going to read through all the subpoints here, but the scenario that I'll paint for you here is I was in a meeting with the C-suite of a publicly traded healthcare organization, and we were talking about, with the CFO, investments in technology. And at this organization, it was readily made known to me that they had a significant number of XP devices within the organization, but funding was denied for whatever reasons, and the CFO was telling me about this, like, yep, we know we have projects in place, but we weren't able to fund it. And the question that I gave to him was, well, that's fine. I understand that you have budgets and you can only spend what's reasonable for the organization, but did anybody talk to you about the risk that you're assuming by not executing that project, by not funding this project? And the CFO looked at me after pausing for about a minute in stone silence, said, no, nobody had that conversation with me. And so I think that's one of the key elements here, is going back to the previous point about this reporting, is having this visibility to understand from an IT standpoint and how it waterfalls to patient quality of care or impact to the rest of the organization, and even spending on projects, that these impacts can be great, but not everybody in the C-suite understands when they make a decision what that translates to from a risk standpoint. And looking at this slide, you can see all these different areas simply as examples of where you can impact from a cybersecurity standpoint your organization, not only in patient safety, but also the rest of the organization that might not necessarily be aware of that. And from a maturity standpoint, we're talking about the journey on medical device security. And like any good or practical security program, there's never an end point. There's never an end game. However, being aware and cognizant from a true industry standpoint and from a true industry capability standpoint, we're fairly early on in the continuum of maturity here. And we're only at this emerging stage of this phase 2 of risk treatment. So visibility and risk profiling, yes. We can identify devices in the network, we can assign some risk to them, and start getting some basic order around what we know. Next thing, risk treatment. How do we be proactive in applying mitigating controls or remediating controls, either with vendors or ourselves, to protect the security of these devices? And then phase 3, this resilient operation, getting it to traditional day-to-day management and not having it in a nebulous bucket, but again, just making it part of the typical practice. And this slide here is an example or a sample of what we're looking at, what we're talking about. When you get to that nirvana, as one of my colleagues likes to say, you want to be able to break this down tangibly on a slide and summarize, here's our risk related to medical devices, here's our risk related to IoT devices and traditional systems, and putting it on a page to show not just impact from a compliance standpoint, but across the board. How does this impact the CFO? How does this impact the CMIO? How does this impact everybody across the organizations? And this is really the ultimate goal that we want to get to. And Matt, can you take us through our last polling question, please?
I'd be happy to do that. We've gone ahead and brought this question up, asking our audience members, what area do you believe your organization is most likely to invest, either financial or staff resources, etc., to reduce your risk? Is it going to be in the traditional security, password, patch areas? Is it in insurance? Is it in evolving security capabilities such as network visibility and control? Do you think it's going to be in device-specific security mitigation, or is it something other than what we've listed there? Gentlemen, we're bringing forward those results, so once again we turn to you for a little bit of analysis on what you see.
Yeah, so some interesting responses here. I think to see such a high percentage of organizations really kind of call out evolving security capabilities such as network visibility and control really speaks to the theme of the conversation here today. Is that I think organizations are really waking up to the risk that is in this category and becoming aware that the foundational techniques associated with being able to put a overall security framework in place at your business that will support your overall governance, risk, and compliance objectives is really going to require in the future here the ability to actually understand this visibility and control category. And so it's great to see that really stood out to the team. I think it speaks to the evolution for organizations in this area.
And not to be gloom and doom, but to show or simply highlight, we need to sometimes go back to the fundamentals before we can start doing the next generation of security trends and technology, or started adopting those other new and emerging technologies that are taking place today. So breaking down the ability to address medical devices and IoT devices, really comes down to having a sustainable visibility management program. You need to go through and be able to quantify your current states. Stop talking about medical devices and IoT devices in the ether. Bring it on paper. Jim mentioned metrics. Identify the number of devices we have to the C-suite. Show them what you are tasked with protecting. Make it very clear what our gaps are from that standpoint. And then start talking about how do we get everybody involved, so stakeholders. What do we do when we identify devices? Most organizations have disparate procurement channels. Simply starting to bring everybody together as a team from that initial operational program standpoint is going to be key. And then bringing some order to it. So the idea of this risk-centric activity, start making it clear of what is the highest priorities from the organization standpoint. Most companies can assist you with that, but really as an organization, you're going to have to set your own risk appetites and thresholds of what is the priority for us to protect. And then the fourth piece, really sustainability. How do we keep this going so that it's effective and the technology we get is not shelfware, or the processes we have fall away because somebody switched roles in an organization. And ultimately, how do we educate our end users, not only the individuals charged with caring for our patients, but those that are also in charge of caring for the technology that care for the patients. And with that, that's the conclusion of the content that we have today. And Matt, just like to open it up to see if there's any questions for us.
Absolutely. Some great questions have already come in. But let's go ahead and dive right into this. And the first one, well, we probably won't have time for your top 10 list to respond to this one, asks us what key items the IT team or the security area needs to be aware of to have the best chance of success to address what you've been talking about here around medical devices and IoT issues. So maybe a couple of areas that you can suggest that they pay attention to first. Maybe Jim, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, as we think about this area, it really starts with visibility, is your ability to understand what is in your environment and how confidently you can answer that question as an organization today. And once you kind of establish that baseline, that holistic asset inventory, it's about just continuous monitoring. This isn't just a one-time exercise. We see a lot of organizations, they're going through the painstaking efforts of doing manual research on this and data collection on Excel spreadsheets. You're looking to really probably evolve your capabilities in this area, because this is going to be a continuous requirement as you move forward. So ensuring that you gain that initial visibility and having continuous programs in place around that, so you can always understand your risk profile.
And to add to that, I believe keeping a focus on risk being central to everything that you're doing, and avoid the threat and compliance focus. I see a lot of organizations get hung up on compliance or the latest and greatest threats, and I'm a firm believer in that if you have a solid program in place and you have some good risk management and good risk guiding principles within your organization, the threats and compliance are going to come along with it. They're going to be covered, but you need to bring that order and that consistency. So when you have highs and lows, that risk guidance is going to keep you steady in the light of whatever greatest technology comes out or the latest update to our regulation.
Thank you very much for that, gentlemen. Our next question comes from someone in the audit area, as they were asking what role can internal audit or audit play in addressing these security issues. So, Chris, maybe we'll start with you on this one.
I think audit has an opportunity to evolve from its traditional role of being a more reactive or detective control, if you will. So audits typically happen after the fact, and it's a very point-in-time scenario. And of course, yes, audits happen during courses of projects and significant events within a health organization, but really it's a static process. But if the audit team can partner with the business line to help give visibility to some of those gaps I mentioned between resources and the likelihood of being able to address risk issues that have been identified, and also having the opportunity to look at the bigger picture. So, okay, great, we did an audit. You have issues in your biomed program. So what? Well, audit's in a unique position between the business as well as IT and compliance and the board and, of course, the audit committee to say, well, wait a minute, these areas can have impact to quality. These areas can have impact to compliance. These areas can also have impact to revenue cycle, and really elevate the conversation as opposed to traditional audit identifying the gaps that have been identified, time to close, and things along those lines. So I think there's a really unique opportunity for audit to elevate its position with respect to cybersecurity.
Yeah, maybe one thing to add to that would be, just how can you try to drive some automation around that exercise, right? Sometimes the audit function can feel a little, challenging because you're having to do a number of things. You're digging deep and you're trying to get to the answers, and sometimes that can be fairly manual. And we've had a lot of conversations with CISOs who have emphasized the importance of this is, where can we leverage more automated approaches? Where can we leverage technology to help drive outputs and workflows that help us crisply answer the critical questions that are at the top of mind for auditors? So that'd probably be the last piece I would add to that.
Thank you very much, Jim. And we're coming up near the top of the hour, but I've got one question that I think is really a great one I'd like to just squeeze in here real quick. And it has to do with overlooked items. We had someone write in to ask us, what do you see as the most overlooked item addressing medical device IoT risks? So maybe real quick on that, gentlemen, as we begin wrapping things up. And Jim, maybe we'll turn to you first.
Yeah, I think the primary thing here is how do you have actionable information in this category? How can you possess information that isn't just surface level about, kind of generic or loose quantities of devices or characterization of particular devices? As a security professional, the more you know, the more effective you can be. So being crisp and just understanding very accurately the important information about, not only how many, but what types. We talked today about the risk spectrum of devices, the different components underlying at a device layer that can really amplify your risk significantly. So the more crisply you can understand the answers to the test, the more effective your security program is going to be.
And the last piece I'll add is people, process, and technology. You buy a technology, you need to have the processes and the resources or the people in place to get that technology to be in an effective state and making sure it's sustainable. Same thing on the process side. You implement new processes, look at automation, look at efficiencies, look at the technology, but then also look at awareness for the people side to make sure that folks are aware that this is a process or the program in place. And so really look at holistically the solutions you identify, that they make sense, and perhaps it's doing less over a period of time instead of trying to take a big chunk and doing it all at once. And so it's really more building crawl, walk, run, the maturity to address the problems that we're talking about today.
Gentlemen, great response there. Some great guidance to our audience members as well. We'll bring us to the end here. We'll begin wrapping up. I do have some additional questions that came in, but unfortunately we'll have to defer those to follow up outside of the live broadcast, so we appreciate those from our attendees as well. To all of our attendees, thank you for spending an hour of your day with us. It's a precious commodity, and we hope that you found it valuable sharing it with us today. Have a great day.